In the winter of 304 AD, a child walked willingly toward her own execution through the marble corridors of the Roman city of Emerita Augusta, in what we now call Merida, Spain. Her footsteps echoed through halls that had witnessed countless deaths, but what was about to unfold would be unlike anything the empire had ever seen. Her name was Eulalia, and she was only 13 years old. The Roman Empire, at the absolute height of its power and brutality, was about to unleash 13 separate tortures upon this girl, one for each year of her young life. What drove a child to seek out her own destruction? What could possibly happen in those final hours that would shake the foundations of the mightiest empire the world had ever known? This is a story that history tried to bury, but the blood spilled that day would stain the conscience of an empire for centuries to come. To understand why a 13-year-old girl would choose death, we must first understand the monster she was facing. Emperor Diocletian had risen from nothing to become one of Rome's most ruthless rulers, and by the year 303, he was watching his empire crumble from within. Barbarian hordes pressed at every border, the economy was collapsing, and chaos threatened to tear apart everything Rome had built. Diocletian needed a scapegoat, and he found it in the growing Christian population. These believers refused to honor the Roman gods, refused to make sacrifices to the emperor, and in Diocletian's mind, they were the cancer destroying Rome's soul. On February 24, 303 AD, he issued an edict that would become known as the Great Persecution, the most systematic and brutal attempt to eliminate Christianity that the world had ever seen. Churches were to be burned to the ground, sacred texts destroyed, Christian property seized, and anyone who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods would lose everything they owned, their position, their freedom, and eventually, their lives. This wave of terror reached the prosperous city of Emerita Augusta, a gleaming jewel of Roman civilization with its massive amphitheater, elaborate aqueducts, and marble temples that seemed to touch the sky. It was here, among the elite and educated, that Christianity had taken secret root, spreading through households where even the wealthy gathered in darkness to share forbidden teachings. Into this world of marble and secrets, Eulalia had been born around 90 AD to a family of considerable wealth and hidden Christian devotion. Her parents had given her everything: education, privilege, and a future of comfort. They taught her to read the great Roman poets, but also the forbidden Christian texts, creating in her a dual education that would prove catastrophic, because the girl who emerged was brilliant, passionate, and possessed of an almost reckless courage that terrified her own family. When Diocletian's edict reached their city in the spring of 303, Eulalia's parents knew immediately that their outspoken daughter was in mortal danger. While other Christians fled or went into hiding, while some even publicly renounced their faith to save their lives, Eulalia refused to be silent. She openly challenged the religious practices around her, spoke boldly about her beliefs, and seemed to have no concept of self-preservation. Her desperate parents made a decision. They would take her to their countryside villa, far from the city and far from the eyes of imperial officials, where she could practice her faith in safety until the storm passed. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had never truly understood the depth of their daughter's conviction, or the extent of her courage. To Eulalia, hiding in comfort while other Christians suffered and died wasn't safety. It was cowardice. It was betrayal of everything she believed in. On a cold December night, while her family slept peacefully in their country estate, 13-year-old Eulalia slipped away into the darkness with a single companion, possibly a servant girl named Julia. The two traveled miles through the winter night on foot, arriving at the Forum of Emerita Augusta just as dawn broke over the city's temples. What happened next would be recorded by multiple witnesses, each account adding layers of horror to an act of defiance that would stun even the most hardened Roman officials. Eulalia didn't simply present herself to the authorities and ask to be arrested. She launched into a public denunciation of Roman religion that echoed through the Forum and drew crowds of shocked onlookers. Standing before Governor Dacian's tribunal, this tiny girl, barely reaching the shoulders of the armed soldiers surrounding her, delivered what amounted to a declaration of war against the empire itself. The fragments of her speech that survive suggest she called the Roman gods demons, their temples houses of lies, and the emperor himself a servant of Satan. She mocked Jupiter as an adulterer and tyrant. She spat on the cult of emperor worship, declaring it the height of human arrogance. The crowd, initially amused by what seemed like a child's tantrum, slowly fell silent as they realized this was no game. This girl was signing her own death warrant with every word that left her mouth. Governor Dacian found himself in an impossible position. Here was a man charged with maintaining order and religious conformity, suddenly confronted with a child whose defiance threatened to make a complete mockery of imperial authority. The historical sources tell us he initially tried to reason with her, invoking her youth, her family's prominent status, and all the pleasures of life she was throwing away. He offered her not just forgiveness, but rewards, marriage into nobility, wealth, and position, if she would simply perform the required sacrifice. Some accounts even suggest he tried to make it easy for her, telling her to just touch the incense or speak the words without meaning them, a compromise many Christians had accepted to save their own lives. But Eulalia's response shattered any hope of resolution. In full view of everyone assembled, she knocked over the altar, scattered the sacred incense across the stones, and spat directly at the image of the emperor. These were acts of sacrilege that under Roman law demanded immediate and severe punishment. Yet even then, Dacian hesitated, because executing a child, especially one from a prominent family, carried serious political risks. He understood that martyrs often created more problems than they solved, inspiring others to similar acts of defiance. So he ordered Eulalia imprisoned, likely hoping that a night in chains would break her resolve, or that her wealthy parents would arrive with enough gold to make this problem disappear. But in that dark, fetid prison cell, something else was happening entirely. Rather than breaking, Eulalia's spirit seemed to grow stronger. Christian sources claim she spent the entire night in prayer and song, her voice carrying through the prison and inspiring other Christian prisoners while unnerving the guards who had to listen. By morning, word of the young girl's defiance had spread throughout the entire city, and crowds gathered at the forum to see what would happen next. Governor Dacian faced a crisis: release her and appear weak before the empire, or execute a child and potentially create a martyr whose death might inspire even greater resistance. The historical records vary on exactly what happened next, but they all agree on one thing: what followed was absolutely horrific. Dacian ordered that Eulalia be tortured until she recanted, employing methods designed to break hardened adult criminals on a 13-year-old girl's body. The tradition speaks of 13 tortures, one for each year of her short life, and while this may be symbolic rather than literal, the catalogue of suffering recorded by ancient witnesses reflects the genuine brutality of Roman judicial torture. The goal wasn't merely to punish, it was to create a public spectacle that would terrify anyone else who might consider defiance. But what the authorities hadn't counted on was that their victim would transform this spectacle of terror into something else entirely, something that would outlive the empire itself and haunt the conscience of Rome for generations to come. What happened to Eulalia in those final hours would become one of the most disturbing testimonies of religious persecution in all of human history, and the empire that killed her would never be quite the same again. The first tortures employed against Eulalia followed standard Roman judicial procedure, beginning with flogging, a punishment that alone could kill a grown man, let alone a child. The implements used progressed from leather whips to metal-tipped scourges designed to tear flesh from bone. Yet multiple witnesses reported something that confounded everyone present. Eulalia not only endured each blow, but seemed to welcome it, responding not with the expected pleas for mercy, but with prayers and hymns. This response completely baffled her torturers, who were accustomed to victims who begged, cursed, or quickly capitulated. The spectacle was beginning to shift from a demonstration of imperial power into something far more unsettling, a display of a power that seemed to transcend physical suffering itself. The escalation that followed reveals both the desperation of the authorities and the strange, twisted dynamic developing between persecutor and victim. Iron hooks were used to tear at her sides, a torture typically reserved for the most hardened criminals. Burning torches were applied directly to her open wounds, the smell of burning flesh filling the forum and causing some in the crowd to turn away in horror. Yet with each new torture, Eulalia's defiance only seemed to strengthen, and the crowd's unease deepened. Some sources claim she taunted her torturers, asking if this was truly the best their gods could inspire, while others describe her maintaining an almost supernatural serenity, her lips moving in constant prayer even as her young body was systematically destroyed. The use of boiling oil and molten lead poured over her wounds represented a complete departure from standard procedure. These were tortures typically reserved for slaves who had murdered their masters or soldiers who had committed the worst treason. That they were being employed against a 13-year-old girl suggests either exceptional cruelty on Governor Dacian's part, or more likely, a complete breakdown in the normal order of things. The crowd, which had initially gathered expecting entertainment, began to murmur and shift with visible discomfort. Some accounts mention women weeping openly in the streets, while even battle-hardened soldiers reportedly looked away, unable to watch. The execution was becoming a public relations disaster, transforming the intended victim into something approaching a hero before everyone's eyes. In a moment when the torture seemed to pause, whether from sheer exhaustion of the torturers or a final desperate attempt by Dacian to secure her recantation, Eulalia allegedly delivered her final testimony. It wasn't a plea for her life, but a sermon on the absolute powerlessness of earthly authority against divine truth. She spoke of resurrection, of eternal life that made temporary suffering meaningless, and of a kingdom not built on violence and fear, but on love and sacrifice. Whether these exact words were actually spoken or were later attributed to her by Christian writers, they capture something essential about the nature of her resistance, a complete inversion of Roman values that prize power, honor, and physical domination above everything else. The decision to end it with fire, to burn Eulalia alive, represented both an admission of failure and a final attempt to restore order through horrifying brutality. The pyre was constructed in the forum itself, a public statement that resistance would be met with the ultimate sanction. Yet even this final act would be transformed by witnesses and Christian tradition into something transcendent. As the flames consumed her small body, people claimed to see a white dove emerge from her mouth, her soul ascending to heaven in visible form. Snow allegedly began to fall from a completely clear sky, covering her burned remains in a shroud of pure white. Whether these miraculous elements actually occurred or were born from the profound psychological trauma of witnessing a child's execution, they speak to the human need to find meaning in senseless brutality. The immediate aftermath reveals that the execution had completely failed as a deterrent. Rather than cowering in fear, Christians emerged from hiding to claim her body, risking their own lives to provide proper burial. The site of her martyrdom became an immediate focus of veneration, with believers leaving flowers and prayers despite official prohibitions. Governor Dacian's reports to Rome likely emphasized the successful elimination of a dangerous agitator, but the reality on the ground was devastatingly different. Eulalia's death had created exactly what the authorities had desperately sought to prevent, a rallying point for Christian resistance and a symbol that would transcend local significance to inspire believers across the entire empire. Within days, Christians were sharing accounts of her martyrdom, each retelling adding layers of meaning and miraculous detail. The story spread along Roman roads and trade routes, reaching Christian communities from Gaul to Africa with astonishing speed. In an age before any form of mass communication, this dissemination speaks to how powerfully her story resonated with believers facing their own persecution. She had become not just a martyr, but an archetype, living proof that faith could overcome even the empire's most brutal oppression, that even a child could defeat Caesar through the simple act of refusing to submit. The historical irony becomes almost unbearable when we consider that, within a single decade of Eulalia's horrific death, the very empire that executed her would begin its transformation into a Christian state. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. By 380 AD, Christianity would become the official religion of Rome. The gods for whom Eulalia was tortured and killed would be abandoned, their magnificent temples converted to churches or left to crumble into romantic ruins. Governor Dacian, who ordered her execution, would be remembered only as a villain in religious literature, while the child he killed would be venerated for centuries as a saint. Basilicas would be raised in her honor, her feast day celebrated across the Christian world, and her story told to millions. The cult of Saint Eulalia that emerged in the centuries following her death transformed suffering into spiritual power. The basilica built over her tomb in Merida became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in all of Hispania, drawing believers from across Europe who came to pray at the site where a child had defeated an empire. Modern archaeological excavations in Merida have uncovered physical evidence that corroborates the basic historical framework of Eulalia's story. The remains of the forum where she was likely executed, the prison where she may have been held, and most importantly, the continuous veneration of her burial site from the 4th century onward all support the essential truth of her martyrdom. The layers of construction over her tomb, from simple grave to elaborate basilica, tell the story of how a single death became the foundation for centuries of communal memory and identity. These physical remains ground the sometimes fantastic hagiographic accounts in historical reality. Eulalia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about faith, power, and the price of conviction. What drives a child to choose death over compromise? What does it say about an empire that it would torture a 13-year-old girl to death for refusing to burn incense? And perhaps most disturbingly, what does it say about human nature that such stories continue to repeat throughout history, in different forms, in different empires, but always with the same essential elements: power demanding submission, and conscience refusing to yield? The girl who walked into that forum in the winter of 304 AD has been dead for more than 17 centuries, but her story refuses to die. It lives on in the basilicas that bear her name, in the prayers still whispered at her shrine, and in the uncomfortable reminder that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply the refusal to bow, even when every rational calculation suggests that resistance is futile. Eulalia defeated the Roman Empire not through violence or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of dying for what she believed, and in doing so, she helped transform the world.